Okay, welcome back. Now we're going to look at our overhead variances, and we're going to look at our variable overhead variances and our fixed overhead variances. And then we're going to talk about which of those costs are controllable by the plant manager and which ones we do not consider controllable. Okay, let's head over there. Okay, so what you have here is this is our fact sheet. So this is actually kind of what's going on. So our standard costs, we have our direct materials and our direct labor standard costs, which we don't care about for this exercise, but for completeness, we have them. Our factory overhead, variable overhead, again, we're going to allocate based on direct labor. So if one unit requires 10 hours of direct labor, then we apply factory overhead for one unit at a rate of 10 hours at $4 per hour. Our factory fixed overhead is same 10 hours at $1.60 an hour. All right, and then we have our flexible budget. So this tells us what we should expect our standard at 70% of capacity, 75% of capacity, and 80% of capacity. And 80% of capacity is how high we think we'll go. So at 70% capacity, we expect that we will produce 35,000 units, that those 35,000 units will require 350,000 hours of labor, and that our variable overhead will be 1.4 million, and our fixed overhead will be 600,000. You notice that in our budget, our fixed overhead is always the same because our fixed costs don't change based on the level of production. We also found out that during the month we're looking at, we operated at 70% capacity. So this becomes our standard in this column under 70% capacity. And the employees worked 340,000 hours. So already we know we're going to have a variance because our standard at 70% capacity is for our employees to work 350,000 hours, but they only worked 340. All right, that's important to know. So let's see if Excel is going to be my friend and let me highlight just that. No, but it'll let me make it red, so we'll do that. All right, and then we have our actual overhead costs. So we're going to go to our worksheet over here, and we are going to take a look at our overhead costs. All right, so our actual overhead, we know that because it was given to us. So our actual variable overhead was 1,375,000, and our actual fixed overhead was 628,600. All right, our allocation rate per hour, we know that as well, right? We said we are allocating variable overhead at $4 per hour and fixed overhead at $1.60 per hour. So 4 and 1.6. All right. Standard hours at actual level of production. So our actual level of production was 70% of capacity. Our standard direct labor hours at 70% capacity is 350,000. So I am just going to link over to this 350,000. Again, we know our actual level of operation was 70% capacity. So we find the standard at 70% capacity, and that becomes our standard hours at actual level of production. So if that's the case, then our applied overhead would be the standard hours times $4 and standard hours times $1.60. So our variance then is actual minus our standard, actual minus our standard, and that gives us an overhead variance of 40,600 unfavorable. Okay, our variable overhead variance is favorable. Our fixed overhead variance is unfavorable. It's very unfavorable. And so our total variance is unfavorable. So let's go figure out what the heck happened here. All right. So our variable overhead variance can be split into a spending variance and an efficiency variance. This is very similar to what we did for direct labor. So our spending variance is our actual variable overhead minus our actual hours times our standard variable rate. So our actual variable overhead, we know, is 1,375,000, and our actual hours, we said, were 340,000 times a rate of $4 an hour. Okay, and I got that 340,000 from right here. So our total variable overhead spending variance is this minus this, 15,000 unfavorable. So this is an unfavorable variable overhead spending variance. Okay. So that means our rate was actually more than $4 an hour. Why is that? Maybe we used more supervisor hours. Maybe we had higher indirect variable costs than we thought. Maybe we used more glue than we thought we were going to use. Okay. Now the next one is our efficiency variance. And our efficiency variance is actual hours times standard variable rate minus the standard hours times the standard variable rate. So our actual hours times the standard variable rate is, our actual hours were 340,000 times 4. So 1,360,000. If we had used our standard hours at 70% capacity, it would have been 350,000 hours. In fact, let me link that so when you go back and look at it, you know where I'm getting these numbers, times our standard rate of $4 an hour, which would have been 1.4 million. So when I take the one on the left, subtract the one on the right, it turns out that I have a favorable variable overhead efficiency variance. And that basically is because I use less direct labor hours. So if I'm allocating at a rate of $4 an hour, if I use less direct labor hours, I'm going to allocate less overhead. So it doesn't mean I actually spent less overhead. And in fact, you can see, well, actually, we did spend less overhead because we used less direct labor hours. Okay, so coming up here, let's add our two variances together. Our 15,000 unfavorable spending variance plus our 40,000 favorable efficiency variance, and we end up with a favorable variable overhead variance of 25,000, which is exactly what we saw. All right, let's go down then and look at our fixed overhead variance. So our fixed overhead variance is going to be, we're going to split it into a spending variance and a volume variance, which is uncontrollable. And we're going to talk about what that means in a second. So our spending variance is our actual fixed overhead minus our budgeted fixed overhead. Remember, our budgeted fixed overhead is what we expected it to be. Because fixed overhead doesn't change based on the number of units, we're going to do this in whole dollars rather than with a rate. And then we'll look at the rate when we come over to the volume variance. So our actual fixed overhead, we know that was 628,000 or 628,600. Our budgeted fixed overhead, if I go over to our budget, was 600,000. So my variance is 28,600 unfavorable. This is my unfavorable fixed overhead spending variance. Okay, so this says we actually spent more than we budgeted. So maybe depreciation went up, maybe the rent on our facility went up, something that's sitting in fixed overhead. Our insurance could have gone up, but something that's sitting in that fixed overhead went up and it was more than we budgeted for. And so that is our spending variance. Then we also have our volume variance, and this is our uncontrollable variance. Basically what this says is if you end up using or making more or less, using more or less hours than you plan to, or making more or less product than what was in the budget, then you're going to have a variance because you're only applying the fixed overhead at a rate of $1.60 per level or per hour, per direct labor hour, right? So if we purposely produce at a level other than what was originally budgeted, we're going to end up with a variance, and that really can't be blamed on the plant manager, right? Because if someone comes and says, I need you to make more, I need you to make less, that's what the plant manager is going to do. So we're not going to hold them accountable for the volume variance. So our volume variance is our budgeted fixed overhead minus our standard hours times our standard fixed rate. So our budgeted overhead, again, we said was 600,000. And our standard hours times our standard fixed rate is our 350,000 times, actually, let me link these so you'll be able to look at it, times our rate, our standard rate of 1.6. Oh, something bad's happened. Let's undo that. Okay, so we're going to go down here and it's going to be our standard hours times fixed rate of 560. And when we do the math on that, we are going to end up with an unfavorable volume variance. And when we add our two variances together, we end up with a 68,600 unfavorable fixed overhead variance. Okay, so that's what we ended up with. So we know we're good. All right, I want to talk to you a little bit more about this uncontrollable variance. So our budget is at 78% capacity. That means this 600,000, in order for it to be allocated 100%, not over, not under allocated, but exactly right allocated, we would have to have been working at 75% of capacity. Okay, so let me show you. Plus 600,000 is how much we thought fixed overhead was going to be, and we would have made 37,500 units or spent 375 direct labor hours if we had been working at our 75% capacity. And that would have given us our 1.6. So if we make a decision to operate at 70% capacity, we are by definition going to under apply our fixed overhead. We're going to have more fixed overhead. We're going to spend more than what we've actually applied to our product. If we purposely decide to operate at 80% of capacity, then we are going to over apply fixed overhead because we're going to be making more than basically the numbers we used to come up with this 1.6 or $1.60 per hour rate. And if that still doesn't make sense, pop by office hours. This one, you kind of got to wrap your head around it for a minute. But basically, that's why it's uncontrollable, because the fixed overhead allocation rate only works out perfectly if you make exactly what's in your budget and exactly the number of units that you contemplated when you came up with that rate of 1.6 or $1.60 per hour. Anything else you make is going to absolutely result in a variance. All right, so the last thing I want to do is, when we're looking at fixed overhead, we look at our controllable overhead variance. That's the part that we can go talk to the plant manager and say, hey, something went wrong, you can go fix this, versus our uncontrollable, which is we decided to make a different number of units than the fixed asset overhead allocation, or the fixed overhead allocation rate, than how it was calculated. All right, so my spending variance, my variable overhead spending variance was 1,500 unfavorable. My efficiency variance was 40,000 favorable. Let's put this up here. Always want to mark these as favorable and unfavorable. My fixed overhead spending was 28,600, and that was unfavorable. So my total controllable variance was only 3,600, and we're looking at these big numbers and that looks terrible, but overall our plant manager did okay, right? They only came up 3,600 over where they should have been. So they went over in some areas and then they compensated for it in other areas. Our uncontrollable variance was the 40,000 volume variance. So our total overhead variance is 43,600, and that's exactly what we had, 43,600 unfavorable. All right, so that's how we do our overhead variances. That is going to conclude the lectures. There's a second worksheet that you can work through, the flexible budget, and all of the variances, and I'll put the answer key out there. And if you have questions on it, feel free to email me or come to office hours Thursdays at 1. You can access them via Confer Zoom within the Canvas module. All right, guys, I will see you next time.